Jessica Tarlov did it again on the topic of Plattner. We talked about yesterday, Plattner has had a series of scandals and most recently information about years ago when he was already married to his current wife, who has come out and supported him and said we worked through these issues, but he was sexting other women. And you say that's a bad thing to do. Bad. And we have standards and principles. And MAGA, you don't get to say anything about it because your president is Trump. And he crushed the standards and the principles, right? You remember that? You remember the tape that came out of him? Do you remember the sexual abuse case that came out of him? Do you remember his bromance with Jeffrey Epstein? Do you remember what we're hearing now about his nipple thing? Do you remember all that, right? So the spanking with the magazine of his face on it with a porn star while his wife just had a baby? You remember all that? So we can have an inner Democratic Party discussion about our standards. Where does power conflict with principle? And how do we uphold principles while seeking power, etc.? How do we act differently in a moment with Trump? Do our standards drop? We can have that discussion. You don't get to say anything. Sorry. And Jessica Tarlov kind of made that point in a really effective way. And at the end of this clip, sometimes you'll see this in YouTube titles like Tarlov silences co-host. She literally makes the other co-host go, oh, because she... And
to what Greg said about nothing changes if Susan Collins is the senator, again, if she wins re-election, that is the problem for Mainers, and that is the problem across this country. They want change agents. You guys were the ones who were telling me in 2016.
What happens if you don't get it?
What do you mean? Then,
no, what does the world end?
You know what happens? So Susan Collins, who touts...
Is that the standard? Elections don't matter unless you're saying the world would end if it didn't go your way.
Her independent streak now votes with Trump 95% of the time. So she continues to back his agenda. And guess what? There's going to be 1, maybe 2 Supreme Court seats up. And Susan Collins is going to vote for his nominee, who will be an even younger Brett Kavanaugh, like she did for Kavanaugh. And you know who won't do that? Graham Plattner will stand in the way.
So you're validating exactly what I said. Yeah. You are painting some kind of an existential...
I do think it is. When you look at the decision,
so you would vote
Susan
for him.
Collins, who likes to hang her
vote
proverbial
for a guy with
hat
a Nazi
on,
tattoo.
Listen, I said I am.
Every single person I've talked to who is in the military, Kayla and I were just talking about this, and you present the tattoo story, all of them are like, oh, Plattner's definitely telling the truth. I guess we can't know. And some people have, like his former campaign manager turned critic says, no, like I knew that it was, but I was texting previously about it, the fact that it was. Quickest pause to request that you click the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. It's completely free and it's the simplest way to support the work that we do right below the video. Click that subscribe button and then also whatever you're thinking or some random statement, drop it in the comments. That helps algorithmically, and click the like button. Back to the video. But when I look at his social media history, and I think about the circumstances where you get a skull and crossbones tattoo, I believe on that. I believe his explanation that he wasn't walking around around Jewish family members or Jewish brother-in-law at the wedding taking his shirt off and knowingly having a Nazi tattoo. I believe his explanation on that. And when almost everyone hears this story, I just saw someone say that on X, they expect when people go, a Nazi tattoo is a swastika. And then you see it and you go, I didn't know that was a Nazi tattoo. When you see the actual thing, it just looks like, oh, skull and cross.
What we just watched was a panel debate that started as a conversation about one Senate race in Maine and ended up accidentally exposing one of the most fundamental tensions in American politics right now. The argument Republicans were making is a straightforward. Graham Plattner has personal scandals indefinitely, explicit messages, a tattoo with disputed origins. Therefore, Maine voters should stick with Susan Collins. The argument Democrats were making is equally straightforward. Every single scandal you just listed, the infidelity, the explicit content, the connections to questionable people, the questions about character, applies in far greater detail and with far more documentation to the man your party just elected president twice. So the credibility to make that argument simply isn't there. And here is the thing, there's actually a serious point worth checking about carefully. When one side of the political aisle spends years telling voters that characters doesn't matter, that what counts is results, strength, loyalty, and fighting for your people. They are not just making an argument about one candidate. They are teaching voters on both sides how to think about leadership. And eventually, the other side learns the same lesson. That is what Jessica Tolov was pointing at. When you lower the standard, when you tell millions of people that a long documented history of personal misconduct, legal judgments, and credible allegations doesn't disqualify someone from the highest office in the land, you cannot then turn around and use personal misconduct as your primary argument against someone else. So the standard you abandon doesn't come back just because it's convenient. Now, does that mean personal character shouldn't matter? No. Why no? Most people across the political spectrum would agree that character matters in leadership. Consistency between private behavior and personal value matters. Honesty matters. Accountability matters. Matters because it matters. But you cannot selectively apply those standards. That's not a principle, that's a strategy dressed up as principle. The Suzanne Collins piece of this debate is actually the more consequential part. She has spent years building a reputation as a moderate, someone willing to break with her party when it matters. But voting with the same party 95% of the time is not independence. It is alignment with the level of the independence affected. And it is an alignment with the level of independence attached. And the Tobbs decision is the clearest example of that gap between image and record. She described herself as pro-choice. She voted to confirm the justice who provided the votes to overturn Roe v. Wade. Those two things are very difficult to reconcile. Voters in Maine are essentially being asked to choose between a candidate whose personal life has had well-documented problems but who is running on economic populism and working class priorities, and an incumbent whose public image says one thing while her voting record says something considerably different. That is generally hard choice, and reasonable people can disagree about which matters more. What is not a reasonable argument is using character as a disqualifier for one candidate, while actively defending or executing the same or worse in another. Politics has consequences. Standards have consequences. While leaders tell voters that accountability is for other people, that rules apply differently depending on who you support. They are not just making an argument about one election. They are slowly teaching everyone that the rules don't apply to anyone. And that lesson, once learned, is very hard to unlearn.